There are certain moments in a woman's life when everything she believed about love, loyalty, and trust gets shattered so completely that the pieces don't even look like what they used to be. For Nova Carter, it arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in the office of a family court judge, when a man she had loved for 11 years slid divorce papers across a mahogany table. "Sign it, we're done." Nova was 34 years old. She had a degree in interior architecture from Howard University. She had spent the better part of a decade building a small but respected design consultancy that served high-end residential clients across the city. She was elegant, composed, and precise in everything she did, from the way she dressed, to the way she handled her finances, to the way she loved the people in her life. She met Derek Holloway at a charity gala when she was 23. He was 26, freshly promoted to a junior account manager at a mid-tier investment firm, wearing a suit that was slightly too big and a smile that was slightly too confident. He walked up to her at the open bar, told her she was the most beautiful woman in the room, and asked if she'd let him buy her a drink even though the drinks were free. She laughed. He laughed, and something between them clicked with the kind of ease that makes you believe the universe is conspiring in your favor. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on the rooftop of her favorite restaurant with a ring he'd financed on credit, which she didn't know at the time. They married in a ceremony paid for almost entirely by her father, Richard Carter, a man whose name carried weight in real estate development circles across 3 states. Richard Carter wasn't just wealthy. He was strategic, methodical, and deeply protective of his only daughter. He had built his empire from nothing, starting with a single duplex renovation in Baltimore when he was 27 and growing it into a portfolio worth tens of millions over 3 decades. Richard had reservations about Derek from the very beginning. He never said it outright, because Richard Carter was not a man who wasted words on opinions that hadn't been asked for. But Nova saw it in the way her father studied Derek at family dinners. The way he once pulled Nova aside after Thanksgiving and said simply, "A man who talks about what he's going to do is not the same as a man who does it. Watch what he does, baby. Not what he says." Nova loved her father deeply, but she was young and in love and convinced that Derek was different, that he was motivated, that his hunger was admirable, not dangerous. She was wrong. But that realization came slowly, the way erosion works on a coastline. Not in one dramatic storm, but in years and years of small waves wearing away at something that once seemed solid. The first 5 years of their marriage were, by most measures, good. Derek climbed the ladder at his firm. Nova grew her design business. They bought a penthouse apartment in a luxury high-rise downtown, a place Nova had designed herself from the bare concrete up. Every wall, every fixture, every piece of furniture reflected her vision, her taste, her identity. That apartment wasn't just where she lived. It was an extension of who she was. And here's the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this story. The down payment on that penthouse, $420,000, came from Nova's father. Richard Carter wrote the check himself, handed it to Nova at a private lunch, and said, "This is for you, for your home, for your future." He didn't put conditions on it, didn't make it a loan, didn't structure it with legal protections. Because at the time he trusted that his daughter's marriage was solid, that Derek would honor the gift, that some things didn't need contracts because they were held together by something stronger. That trust, that single generous act of faith, would become the battlefield on which everything that followed was fought. Around year 6 of the marriage, Derek started changing, or maybe he'd always been this way and had simply gotten better at hiding it, then worse at hiding it again. He became obsessed with image, with perception, with the way other people saw him. He traded his Toyota for a leased Mercedes. He started buying designer clothes he couldn't quite afford. He talked constantly about the partners at his firm, about their houses in the Hamptons, and their wives who didn't work, and their lifestyles that made his own look, in his words, like we're still playing pretend. Nova tried to be patient. She told herself that ambition wasn't a crime, that wanting more wasn't the same as being ungrateful. But the comments started landing differently. Derek began making remarks about her business, about how interior design wasn't real money, about how her father's success made their own accomplishments look small. He complained that Nova wasn't social enough, wasn't flashy enough, wasn't the kind of wife who made other men jealous. "You dress like you're going to a board meeting," he told her one night before a company party. "Can't you look like you're actually fun for once?" She remembered that comment. She remembered all of them. Not because she wrote them down, but because words like that leave marks that don't show on the skin. They settle somewhere deeper, in the part of you that holds your confidence, your sense of self, your belief that you are enough exactly as you are. The marriage continued to deteriorate through years 7, 8, 9. Derek started working late, started traveling for business more often, started coming home smelling like a perfume Nova didn't own. She asked him about it once, and he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, dismissive, almost amused. "You're paranoid, Nova. I work with women. That's what happens in offices." She told herself to believe him. She told herself that marriages went through rough patches, that her parents had struggled too, before her mother passed when Nova was 19. That commitment meant staying, working, fighting for it, even when it wasn't easy. But commitment is a two-person agreement, and Derek had stopped holding up his end long before Nova realized it. The truth came out, not through a dramatic discovery, not through catching him in the act, but through paperwork. Nova was organizing their home office one Saturday morning when she found a credit card statement she'd never seen before. A card in Derek's name with a billing address that wasn't theirs. On it were charges for hotel rooms, jewelry stores, restaurants she'd never been to, and a recurring monthly payment to a luxury apartment complex across town. She sat on the floor of that office for 45 minutes, holding that statement, feeling the ground shift beneath her in slow motion. Then she did something that would change the trajectory of everything. She didn't confront him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not yet. She took photographs of every page, emailed them to herself, put the statement back exactly where she'd found it, and called her best friend Denise. "I need you to come over," Nova said, her voice eerily calm. "And I need you to bring wine." Denise arrived in 20 minutes. She took one look at the credit card statement and said what Nova already knew, but couldn't bring herself to say out loud. "He's got a whole other woman, Nova. Probably has had one for a while." The investigation that followed, and it was an investigation, methodical, thorough, and devastating, revealed the full scope of Derek's betrayal. Her name was Simone Langley. She was 27, worked as a promotional model for luxury brands, and had been seeing Derek for the better part of 2 years. 2 years! While Nova was designing homes for clients, cooking dinners, maintaining their social life, trying to save a marriage she didn't know was already dead, Derek was building an entirely separate existence with a woman who was everything Nova wasn't. Flashy, loud, image-obsessed. The kind of woman who posted every meal, every outfit, every vacation on social media like her life was a brand campaign. Derek had been paying Simone's rent, buying her clothes, taking her on trips, all with money that should have been going toward their shared life, their shared future, their shared home. The divorce proceedings lasted 4 months. They were brutal. Derek hired an aggressive attorney who argued that the penthouse was marital property, that Derek was entitled to half of everything, and that Nova's father's down payment was a gift to the marriage, not to Nova individually. Because there was no written agreement specifying otherwise, because Richard Carter had trusted his son-in-law enough not to require one, the court accepted this argument. The ruling hit Nova like a freight train. The judge awarded Derek primary possession of the penthouse. Something about his name being on the mortgage, about the marital property classification, about the way the finances had been commingled over 11 years. Nova's attorney explained it, but the words blurred together into a single devastating conclusion. She was expected to leave, to pack her things, walk out of the home she designed, the home her father had helped buy, and start over somewhere else while Derek kept the keys. The papers were signed on that Wednesday afternoon. Derek slid them across the table, smiled, and said, "Sign it. We're done." Nova signed. But when Derek leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd won, when his attorney started gathering papers and talking about timelines for Nova to vacate, when the whole room seemed to operate on the assumption that this was the end of the story, Nova said something that made every person at that table stop moving. "I'm not leaving." Derek blinked. "Excuse me? The divorce is signed, fine, but I'm not leaving that apartment." Derek's attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, the ruling clearly states that." "Miss Carter," Nova corrected him. She hadn't been Mrs. Holloway in her heart for a long time. "And I heard the ruling. But I have been living in that apartment for 9 years. My belongings are there. My life is there. I'm not leaving until I'm ready." Derek laughed, actually laughed, like she'd told a joke. "Nova, come on, you lost. It's over. Pack your bags and go stay with your father or whatever." Nova stood up, collected her purse, and looked at her ex-husband with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something harder, colder, more dangerous than either. "I'll see you at home, Derek." She walked out of that office and drove straight to the penthouse. Her penthouse, the one she had built with her own hands and her father's money. She went inside, locked the door, sat down on the couch she'd chosen from a showroom in Milan, and for the first time in months, she cried. Not the gentle tears of grief. The deep, shaking, soul-emptying kind of crying that comes when you finally stop pretending you're okay. She cried for an hour. Then she washed her face, made herself tea, and started planning. Derek showed up the next morning expecting to find her packing boxes. Instead, he found her sitting at the kitchen island, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper on her tablet like it was any other Thursday. "You're still here," he said flatly. "I told you I would be." "Nova, this is ridiculous. The apartment is mine. The court said so." "The court said a lot of things, Derek, but it didn't say I had to leave today. Or tomorrow. Or next week. The enforcement timeline is 30 days, and even that requires additional filings. So unless you want to go back to court and spend another $10,000 trying to get a sheriff to escort me out, I suggest you get comfortable." She watched his face cycle through confusion, irritation, and something that looked almost like fear. He wasn't used to this version of Nova. He was used to the woman who accommodated, who adjusted, who kept the peace. This woman, the one sitting calmly at the kitchen island with steel in her eyes, was someone he didn't recognize. "Fine," he said through his teeth. "Stay, but things are going to change around here." Things changed all right, but not the way Nova expected. 3 days later, on a Sunday evening, while Nova was in the second bedroom she'd claimed as her own space, she heard the front door open and the sound of two voices. One was Derek's, the other was female, high-pitched, laughing, and unmistakable. Nova stepped into the hallway and saw her. Simone Langley. Standing in Nova's foyer, wearing heels that clicked against the marble floor Nova had selected, carrying 2 designer suitcases and a garment bag, looking around the penthouse with the wide-eyed appreciation of someone walking into a life she believed she had earned. "Oh," Simone said when she saw Nova. Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened. "You're still here?" She said it the way you'd say it about a stain that hadn't come out in the wash, mildly inconvenienced, faintly amused. Derek stepped forward. "Simone is moving in. This is her home now, too." Nova looked at the suitcases, looked at the garment bag, looked at the woman who had spent 2 years sleeping with her husband in secret and was now standing in her living room like she'd been invited to a housewarming party. "Moving in," Nova repeated. "That's right," Derek said, his voice carrying the edge of someone who expected resistance. "Is that going to be a problem?" Nova looked at both of them for a long moment. Then she turned, walked back to her room, and closed the door. Behind her, she heard Simone giggle. "Well, that was awkward," and Derek's voice, low and satisfied. "Don't worry about her. She'll be gone by the end of the week." Now, what happened inside that penthouse over the next 2 weeks was nothing short of psychological warfare. And the thing about psychological warfare is that the person waging it almost always believes they're winning, right up until the moment they realize they've been outmaneuvered by someone they never took seriously. Derek Holloway thought he was breaking Nova down. He thought every taunt, every humiliation, every carefully staged provocation was pushing her closer to the door. What he didn't understand, what he was fundamentally incapable of understanding, was that every single thing he did was being watched, documented, and filed away by a woman who had stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking like someone who knew exactly how evidence worked. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what those 2 weeks actually looked like from the inside, because the details matter. They always matter. The first morning after Simone moved in, Nova woke up at 6:30, the same time she always did, and walked to the kitchen to make her coffee. She had a routine. French press, dark roast, a specific brand she ordered from a small roaster in Virginia. She'd been making this same coffee in this same kitchen for 9 years. It was muscle memory. It was home. When she opened the cabinet where she kept her coffee, it was empty. Her beans, her French press, her favorite ceramic mug, the one her mother had painted at a pottery class 2 months before she passed, all of it was gone. In its place were bright pink K-cup pods and a brand new single-serve machine still in its box. Nova stood there staring at that empty shelf for a long time. She heard footsteps behind her. Simone appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing one of Derek's dress shirts and nothing else. Her hair pulled up in a messy bun, looking like she'd just rolled out of bed in a perfume commercial. "Oh, I moved some things around," Simone said casually, opening the refrigerator like she'd lived there for years. "I hope you don't mind. The kitchen was so cluttered. I like things clean and simple, you know?" Nova's hands were steady. Her voice was steady. "Where are my things?" Simone waved vaguely toward the hallway. "Boxes in the storage closet, I think. Derek said you'd be leaving soon anyway, so I figured we might as well start making the place ours." Ours. The word hung in the air like smoke. Nova found her belongings in 3 cardboard boxes shoved into the hallway storage closet, alongside old winter coats and cleaning supplies. Her French press was wrapped in a dish towel. Her mother's mug was sitting on top of a pile of kitchen utensils, unprotected, one bump away from shattering. She picked up that mug, held it in both hands, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. She didn't yell, she didn't confront Simone, she didn't call Derek, who had already left for work. She took the mug to her room, placed it carefully on the nightstand, pulled out her phone and took photographs of every box, every displaced item, every empty shelf. She noted the date and time, she described what had been moved and by whom. She saved the photographs to 3 separate cloud accounts. Then she got dressed, made coffee at a cafe down the street, and went to work. This became the pattern. Every day brought a new provocation, and every day Nova responded with the same quiet, methodical discipline that made her so good at her job. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She documented. Day 4. Simone rearranged the living room furniture, pushing Nova's carefully chosen pieces against the walls, and replacing the coffee table with a gaudy gold and glass monstrosity she'd apparently had delivered that morning. She hung a large canvas print of herself and Derek on the wall where Nova's original artwork had been. The artwork, a piece Nova had commissioned from a local artist for their 5th anniversary, was found leaning against the wall in the hallway, face down. Nova photographed everything, noted the date, saved it to the cloud. Day 6. Derek changed the Wi-Fi password and didn't give Nova the new one. When she asked, he shrugged and said, "It's my internet. Get your own." She used her phone as a hotspot without complaint. She noted the date and the interaction in her growing file. Day 8. Simone invited 3 of her friends over for what she called a housewarming brunch. They drank champagne in the living room, tried on clothes in the master bedroom, and took photographs all over the apartment, posing on Nova's furniture, in Nova's kitchen, on Nova's balcony with the skyline view. Nova had fallen in love with the first time she'd seen this unit 9 years ago. One of Simone's friends wandered into the hallway and saw Nova coming out of her room. The friend looked her up and down with the kind of expression people reserve for something unpleasant they've stepped in. "Oh my God," the friend said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's literally still here?" "That's so embarrassing." Laughter erupted from the living room. Simone's voice carried over the noise. "I know, right? It's like she doesn't understand what divorce means. If she had any dignity left, she'd have been gone weeks ago." More laughter, more champagne, more photographs posted to social media with location tags and captions like "new home, new life, new everything," and upgraded with a diamond emoji. Nova was in her room with the door closed. She could hear every word. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap, and let the humiliation wash over her like a wave she'd already decided she would survive. Then she opened her laptop, screenshotted every social media post Simone and her friends had uploaded, and added them to her file. Day 10 was when things escalated beyond petty cruelty and into something genuinely disturbing. Nova came home from a client meeting to find that the lock on her bedroom door had been changed. Her key didn't work. She tried it 3 times, turning it carefully, then firmly, then desperately, before the reality settled in. She was locked out of the only private space she had left. Her clothes were inside, her laptop charger, her mother's mug. She called Derek. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice light, almost cheerful. "Oh yeah, I had the locks redone. Security upgrade." "You understand, Derek. My belongings are in that room. Then I guess you should have taken them with you when you left." "Oh wait." He paused for effect. "You didn't leave. That's the problem, isn't it? I need access to my room. It's not your room, Nova. Nothing here is yours anymore. The court made that very clear. But hey, if you want to come pick up your stuff, I'll leave the door unlocked tomorrow between 9 and noon. That should give you plenty of time to pack and get out for good." He hung up. Nova stood in that hallway, locked out of her own bedroom in her own home, and for one terrible moment, she felt everything start to crack. The composure she'd been holding for 10 days, the discipline, the strategy, all of it trembled on the edge of collapse. She could feel the tears building behind her eyes, the scream rising in her throat, the overwhelming urge to pound on that door until her fists bled. But she didn't. She called Denise instead. Denise showed up 30 minutes later with an overnight bag full of clothes, toiletries, and a laptop charger. She also brought takeout from Nova's favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. "You're staying in there tonight?" Denise asked, looking at the small guest room Nova had retreated to. "I'm staying in this apartment," Nova corrected her, "until I'm ready to leave on my own terms." Denise looked at her for a long moment. "Girl, what are you doing? And I mean really doing? Because this isn't just stubbornness. I've known you for 20 years, and you don't do anything without a reason. So what's the reason?" Nova opened her phone and showed Denise the file. Hundreds of photographs, dated notes, screenshots of social media posts, records of every interaction, every provocation, every act of harassment and property interference, documented with the precision of someone who understood exactly what a court would need to see. Denise scrolled through it slowly, her eyes widening. "Nova, he thinks I'm staying because I'm pathetic, because I can't let go, because I don't have anywhere else to go." Nova's voice was quiet but sharp. "He has no idea why I'm really here. And why are you really here? Because this apartment was bought with my father's money. Because the divorce ruling was based on arguments that misrepresented how this property was acquired. Because Derek's attorney convinced a judge that my father's $420,000 gift was marital property, and I sat there and let it happen because I was too hurt and too exhausted to fight properly. But I'm not exhausted anymore, Denise. I'm awake. And I'm building something that's going to make his little courtroom victory look like a children's game." Denise set the phone down and looked at her best friend with something between admiration and concern. "Does your father know?" Nova paused. "Not yet. Not everything. I am not ready to involve him until I have to. And when will that be? When Derek forces my hand. And he will. Men like him always do. They can't stand being defied. It eats at them until they do something stupid." She was right. Derek did something very stupid on day 12. He called building security. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Nova was sitting in the guest room reviewing contracts for a client project when she heard a knock at the apartment door, followed by Derek's voice, loud, performative, clearly meant for an audience. "Officers, thank you for coming. My ex-wife has been squatting in my apartment for nearly 2 weeks. She has no legal right to be here, and I need her removed." Nova opened the guest room door and walked into the foyer. 2 building security guards stood in the doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable. Behind Derek, leaning against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face, was Simone. "Ma'am," the older security guard began, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Mr. Holloway has requested that we ask you to vacate the premises." Nova looked at him calmly. "May I show you something?" She went to the guest room and returned with a folder. Inside were copies of her identification showing this address as her legal residence. Utility bills in her name going back 6 years. A copy of the original lease, which listed her as a co-tenant. A letter from the building management company acknowledging her as a registered resident. "I've lived in this apartment for 9 years, Nova said, handing the folder to the older guard. "My name is on the original lease. I am a registered resident of this building. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago, but no court order has been issued requiring me to vacate by a specific date. The enforcement timeline hasn't even begun. I am not trespassing. I am not squatting. I am living in my home." The security guards looked at the documents. They looked at Derek. They looked at each other. The older guard handed the folder back to Nova with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Mr. Holloway, we can't remove a registered resident without a court-issued eviction order. You'd need to go through the proper legal channels for that." Derek's face went red, not pink, red. The deep, dangerous crimson of a man who has been embarrassed in front of the woman he's trying to impress. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "She doesn't belong here. This is my apartment. The divorce court awarded it to me." "Sir, that may be the case, but building security isn't authorized to enforce divorce rulings. You'll need to contact your attorney. I want to speak to your supervisor." "Sir, I am the supervisor." Behind Derek, Nova watched something shift in Simone's expression. The satisfied smile flickered, just for a moment, just long enough to reveal something underneath it, a flicker of doubt, a crack in the confidence. Simone had been told that Nova was weak, broken, easily pushed aside. She'd been told that this apartment was Derek's, fully and completely, and that the previous wife was just a temporary inconvenience who'd be gone before the new curtains arrived. But the previous wife was still standing there, still calm, still holding a folder full of documents that had just made 2 security guards walk away without doing a thing. And for the first time since she'd moved in, Simone looked at Nova and saw something that unsettled her. Nova wasn't afraid. Not even a little bit. After security left, Derek slammed the door so hard the walls shook. He turned on Nova with a fury that stripped away every pretense of the charming man she'd married. "You think you're clever? You think this little game is going to work? I will have you dragged out of here, Nova. I will call the police. I will call a judge. I will call whoever I have to call to get you out of my home." "Then call them," Nova said. "But this is still my home too, Derek. Whether you like it or not." He stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the vein pulsing in his temple, could smell the bourbon on his breath at 3 in the afternoon. "You have nothing. You understand that? Nothing. The court gave me this apartment. Your little lawyer couldn't even fight for you properly. And your father, your broke, washed-up father, he can't help you either. Nobody can help you. You're alone." Nova held his gaze without flinching. "Are you finished?" He stared at her for a long, volatile moment. Then he turned and walked to the master bedroom, slamming that door too. Simone lingered in the kitchen, studying Nova with a new expression. Not the smug amusement of the past 12 days, something sharper, more calculating. "You know," Simone said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that certain women use when they're about to say something designed to wound. "I actually feel sorry for you, Nova. I really do. It must be so hard watching someone else live the life you couldn't hold on to." Nova picked up her phone from the counter. She'd left it there during the security encounter, propped against a fruit bowl, screen facing the room. The voice memo app had been recording for the past 47 minutes. "You're right," Nova said evenly. "It must be." She walked back to the guest room, closed the door, stopped the recording, saved it, backed it up. "Day 12, she wrote in her notes. "Security called and refused to remove me. Derek threatened to have me dragged out." Simone made comments on record. 47-minute audio files saved to 3 locations. She put the phone down, leaned back against the headboard, and stared at the ceiling. She wasn't staying because she was desperate. She wasn't staying because she had nowhere to go. She had money. She had Denise's guest room. She had her father's estate in Virginia with 7 bedrooms and enough space to disappear for a year. She was staying because this apartment was built with her family's sacrifice, because $420,000 of her father's life work had been swallowed by a man who'd repaid that generosity with betrayal, because the legal system had failed her, and she refused to walk away from that failure quietly. But mostly, she was staying because she knew Derek, she knew his pride, she knew his ego, she knew that being defied by the woman he considered beneath him would drive him to escalate, and escalation meant mistakes, and mistakes meant evidence, and evidence meant leverage. She just needed him to make one more move. One more arrogant, reckless, irreversible move. He made it on day 14. It was a Saturday morning. Nova was in the guest room answering emails when she heard Derek's voice from the living room, loud, deliberately loud, clearly wanting her to hear every word. "I'm done playing games with her. I'm calling her father." Simone's voice. "You think that'll work? Watch. This old man is broke and embarrassed. His daughter is squatting in my apartment like a homeless person. All I have to do is humiliate him enough, and he'll come drag her out himself. These proud old men, they can't stand looking weak." Nova's fingers stopped moving over her keyboard. Her father. Derek was going to call her father. She heard the speakerphone click on. Heard the dial tone. Heard the rings. 1, 2, 3. Then her father's voice. Calm, measured, deep. The voice of a man who had built and lost and rebuilt fortunes. The voice of a man who had buried his wife, raised his daughter alone, and never once let the world see him bend. "Hello? Richard? It's Derek." A pause. "I know who it is." "Good. Then you know why I'm calling. Your daughter is still in my apartment, Richard. 2 weeks after the divorce, she's still here, living in the guest room like some kind of squatter. It's pathetic, honestly. And it's embarrassing for everyone involved. Silence from the other end. Derek continued, emboldened by the silence, mistaking it for weakness. Look, I've tried to be reasonable. I've tried to give her time. But this is my home now. The court confirmed it. And Nova needs to accept that and move on. More silence. So here's what I need, Richard. I need you to come get your daughter. Talk some sense into her. Remind her that she lost. Because if she's not out of here today, I'm going to start legal proceedings that will make the divorce look like a tea party. And honestly, maybe this is what happens when a bankrupt man raises a daughter who doesn't know when she's beaten. Nova was standing in the hallway now. She could see into the living room where Derek sat on the couch, phone on the coffee table, speakerphone broadcasting her father's silence into the room. Simone was next to him, legs curled underneath her, watching the phone with the expression of someone enjoying a particularly satisfying television show. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Long enough for Derek's smile to falter just slightly. Long enough for even Simone to glance at him with a flicker of uncertainty. Then Richard Carter spoke. "Is my daughter there?" "She can hear you," Derek said. "We're on speaker." "Good." Another pause. When Richard spoke again, his voice hadn't changed. Same tone, same cadence, same absolute, unshakable calm. "Nova, baby, do not leave that apartment. Do not pack a single bag. Do not move from where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The line went dead. Derek laughed. He actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "Well, that should be interesting. The old man's coming to negotiate." Simone laughed too, but hers sounded slightly less certain. "What's he going to do? He's broke, right?" "You said he lost everything." "He did," Derek said confidently. "Trust me, Richard Carter is nobody anymore. He's coming here to beg me to let his daughter leave with some dignity. And I'll let her. Because I'm a generous man." He leaned back on the couch, put his arm around Simone, and smiled the smile of a man who believed with absolute certainty that he was in complete control of the situation. Exactly 28 minutes later, Nova was standing at the window of the guest room, looking down at the street 11 floors below, when she saw them. Not a car. A convoy. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the building's circular driveway in a precise, unhurried formation, the kind of vehicles that didn't need to rush because the people inside them had already won whatever battle they were arriving to fight. They parked in sequence. The doors opened in sequence. And the people who stepped out looked like they had been assembled for exactly this moment, because they had. From the first vehicle, 2 men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases. Lawyers. Nova recognized the cut of their jackets, the purposeful way they moved, the way they scanned the building entrance like they were mapping a courtroom. From the second vehicle, 3 more figures. One was a woman in a charcoal blazer carrying a thick file folder and a tablet. The other 2 were men in security uniforms, not the building's private security, but something else entirely. Private detail. Professional. The kind of security that doesn't ask questions because they already know the answers. And from the third vehicle, stepping out last, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry, was Richard Carter. He was 63 years old, 6'1", silver-haired, clean-shaven, wearing a navy suit that fit him like it had been cut that morning. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish. His posture was that of a man who had spent 40 years walking into rooms full of people who underestimated him, and walking out with everything he came for. He did not look broke. He did not look washed up. He did not look like a man who had come to beg. Nova watched from the window as her father paused on the sidewalk, buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, and looked up at the building. For just a moment, his eyes found the 11th floor, found her window. She couldn't see the details of his expression from this distance, but she didn't need to. She knew that face. She'd known it her entire life. It was the face of a man who had made a promise and intended to keep it. She stepped back from the window, smoothed her blouse, and walked out of the guest room. In the living room, Derek and Simone were still on the couch. Derek had poured himself a bourbon. Simone was scrolling through her phone. One leg draped over Derek's lap, performing the kind of casual intimacy designed to be seen. They looked comfortable. Relaxed. Like 2 people waiting for a pizza delivery, not for the arrival of the man whose daughter they'd spent 2 weeks humiliating. "Your dad's here," Derek said without looking up. "I saw the car pull in. One car. Probably some old sedan. Let's get this over with." The intercom buzzed. Derek stood up, straightened his collar, and pressed the button. Mr. Holloway. The front desk attendant's voice came through, and there was something in his tone. Something careful. Almost nervous. There are several people here to see you. A Mr. Richard Carter and his team. Derek frowned. His team? Yes, sir. Should I send them up? Derek glanced at Simone, who shrugged. Send them up, he said. Nova positioned herself near the hallway entrance, close enough to see and hear everything, far enough to stay out of the initial line of fire. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted it to, but her hands were steady. Whatever was about to happen, she had earned the right to witness it. The elevator chimed in the hallway outside. Footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, measured and purposeful on the marble corridor floor. Then a knock on the door. Not aggressive, not timid. The knock of someone who knows the door will be opened because it has to be. Derek opened the door with his bourbon glass in one hand and his most condescending smile already in place. The smile lasted approximately 4 seconds. Richard Carter stood in the doorway, flanked by 5 people who looked like they had come to dismantle something. Behind them, the building's own property manager hovered at a nervous distance, clutching a clipboard. Richard, Derek said, and his voice had already changed, just slightly, just enough. The cockiness was still there, but underneath it was the first tremor of something he wasn't ready to name. You brought company? I did, Richard said. His voice was exactly as it had been on the phone. Calm, level. The kind of calm that doesn't come from relaxation but from absolute certainty. May we come in? It wasn't really a question. Derek stepped aside and they entered. The 2 lawyers first, setting their briefcases on the dining table with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The woman with the file folder and tablet positioned herself beside them. The 2 security personnel stationed themselves near the door, not blocking it, but present, visible, unmistakable. Richard Carter walked in last. He surveyed the apartment with an expression that was impossible to read. His eyes moved across the living room, the rearranged furniture, the gaudy coffee table, the canvas print of Derek and Simone that had replaced Nova's commissioned artwork. He looked at the kitchen, at the pink K-cup machine where his daughter's French press used to be. He took in every detail with the quiet thoroughness of a man cataloging damages. Then his eyes found Simone. She was standing now, arms crossed, trying to maintain the posture of someone who belonged there. But the confidence she'd carried for 2 weeks was cracking at the seams. The man in front of her looked nothing like the broken, bankrupt father Derek had described. The people flanking him looked nothing like the entourage of a man with nothing left. The air in the room had changed the moment they walked in, and Simone could feel it, could feel the ground shifting beneath her designer heels. So, Derek said, closing the door and positioning himself in the center of the room like a man defending his territory. You're here. You've made your entrance. Very dramatic, Richard. Now, can we get to the point? I need your daughter out of my apartment. Richard looked at him. Just looked at him. For a long, quiet moment that stretched until the silence became its own kind of pressure. Sit down, Derek, Richard said. Excuse me? I said sit down. We have things to discuss, and I'd rather you were seated for what you're about to hear. Derek laughed, but it came out wrong. Too sharp, too loud. The laugh of a man who is starting to suspect he's missed something important. This is my apartment, Richard. I'll stand if I want to. It's not your apartment. The words landed like a detonation. Not because they were loud, because they were quiet. Because Richard said them with the same tone he might use to tell someone the time. Derek blinked. What did you say? Richard turned to the older of his 2 lawyers. Thomas. The lawyer, a man in his late 50s with reading glasses perched on his nose, and the demeanor of someone who had argued before appellate courts and won, opened his briefcase and removed a stack of documents that was at least 2 inches thick. Mr. Holloway, Thomas began. My name is Thomas Whitfield. I'm senior partner at Whitfield, Monroe and Associates. We represent Mr. Richard Carter, and by extension, the Carter Family Trust. I'm here to inform you that the property ruling in your recent divorce proceedings contains several material deficiencies that render it fundamentally unenforceable. Derek's face went blank. What are you talking about? Thomas placed the first document on the dining table. This is the original gift agreement executed between Richard Carter and his daughter Nova Carter, dated 9 years ago, coinciding with the purchase of this apartment. You'll note that the $420,000 down payment was not, as your divorce attorney argued, a gift to the marriage. It was a gift to Nova Carter individually, dispersed through the Carter Family Trust with specific conditions attached. That's not, Derek started, but Thomas continued without pausing. Condition 1. The funds were designated for the sole purpose of securing residential property for the beneficiary, Nova Carter. Condition 2. In the event of dissolution of the beneficiary's marriage, any property acquired with trust funds would revert to the trust's protections, meaning it could not be classified as divisible marital property. Derek's bourbon glass was shaking in his hand. There was no gift agreement. Richard gave us the money, gave it to us, for the marriage. Richard spoke from where he stood by the window. I gave it to my daughter. I gave it through a trust, and the trust had terms. My lawyer reviewed everything. There was nothing, no agreement, no conditions. Thomas placed a second document on the table. That's because your attorney conducted what can only be described as a grossly inadequate review of the property's financial history. The gift agreement was filed with the trust and recorded with the county clerk's office at the time of purchase. It was part of the public record. Your attorney either failed to find it or chose not to look. The room was so quiet that Nova could hear the ice shifting in Derek's bourbon glass. Thomas continued. Furthermore, Mr. Holloway, we have identified several additional issues with the divorce proceedings that call into question the validity of the property ruling. He placed a third document on the table, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each one landed with the soft, devastating weight of a truth that had been waiting for its moment. Issue 1. During the divorce proceedings, you submitted financial disclosures that materially understated your personal debt and overstated your contribution to the household expenses. Specifically, you failed to disclose approximately $93,000 in personal credit card debt, much of it accrued on accounts used to finance your relationship with Ms. Langley. Simone's name hit the air like a slap. She took a step back, instinctively, physically retreating from the sound of her own name in a legal context. Issue 2. You represented to the court that you were the primary mortgage holder and that the property payments came predominantly from your income. Our forensic accountant has determined that in 7 of the 9 years of your marriage, Nova Carter's income from her design consultancy exceeded yours, and her contributions to the mortgage payments were, on average, 14% higher than your own. Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Issue 3. And this one is particularly concerning, Mr. Holloway. Thomas removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Derek. We have evidence that during the divorce proceedings, your attorney submitted a property valuation that was conducted by an appraiser with a pre-existing financial relationship with your firm. The appraiser, a Mr. Dennis Grant, received 2 referral payments from your company in the 18 months preceding the appraisal. This constitutes a conflict of interest that, at minimum, invalidates the appraisal and, at maximum, suggests fraudulent manipulation of the court's decision-making process. Now it was Derek who took a step back. His face had gone from red to white, the bourbon glass trembled and he set it down on the nearest surface before it could fall. That's not, he stammered. Dennis is just a guy we've worked with. That doesn't mean anything. It means, Thomas said patiently, that the property ruling in your divorce was based on a compromised appraisal, incomplete financial disclosures, and a failure to account for trust-protected assets. Any one of these issues would be sufficient to challenge the ruling. Together, they make the ruling virtually indefensible. Richard Carter hadn't moved from the window. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching Derek the way a surgeon watches a monitor during an operation. No emotion, just precision. But there's more, Richard said quietly. Of course there was more. Because Richard Carter hadn't spent 30 minutes driving across town. He'd spent 2 weeks longer. He'd spent months, possibly years, watching and waiting and preparing for the moment when his patience would be worth more than anyone else's power. The woman with the tablet stepped forward. Her name was Adrienne Cole, and she was a licensed private investigator who had been retained by the Carter Family Trust 4 months before the divorce was even filed. Mr. Holloway, Adrienne said, opening her tablet and turning it to face Derek. Over the past several months, I've been conducting an investigation into the financial and personal conduct surrounding the dissolution of your marriage to Nova Carter. You've been investigating me? Derek's voice cracked on the last word. I've been documenting facts, Adrienne corrected him. Would you like to see some of them? She didn't wait for an answer. She swiped through a series of photographs, bank records, and communications that painted a portrait so damning it could have hung in a courthouse. Photographs of Derek and Simone at restaurants, hotels, and resorts, dating back 2.5 years, time-stamped and geotagged, proving the affair began long before Derek claimed in his divorce filings. Bank records showing wire transfers from Derek's personal accounts to Simone's rent, totaling over $68,000 over 26 months, all while he was claiming financial hardship in court. Screenshots of text messages between Derek and his attorney discussing, in explicit terms, how to frame Richard Carter's gift as marital property. One message in particular stood out. Derek had written, "The old man didn't put anything in writing, at least nothing we can find. So we argue it was a wedding gift to both of us and split it down the middle. Easy money." Nova watched Derek read that message on the screen. She watched the color drain from his face entirely, watched his jaw work without producing sound, watched his hands clench and unclench at his sides like they were looking for something to hold on to and finding nothing. That message, Thomas said calmly, suggests deliberate intent to misrepresent the nature of the down payment to the court. In legal terms, Mr. Holloway, that is fraud upon the court. It is grounds not only for overturning the property ruling but for sanctions, fines, and potentially criminal referral. Simone was backing toward the kitchen now, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide. The woman who had spent 2 weeks strutting through this apartment like she owned it was watching the foundation crack beneath her feet in real time. "Derek?" she said. "Derek, what is happening?" He didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was staring at the pile of documents on the dining table like they were a collection of loaded weapons pointed at his chest. "Here's what happens now," Richard Carter said. He stepped away from the window and moved to the center of the room, and when he did, something in the atmosphere shifted. The lawyers, the investigator, the security personnel, even the building's property manager lurking in the hallway, they all seemed to orient toward him like planets around a sun. This was his moment, and he'd waited for it with the kind of patience that only a man who has built and rebuilt his life from nothing can possess. "First," Richard said, "my attorneys will be filing a motion to vacate the property ruling in your divorce. Based on the evidence Thomas just presented, the compromised appraisal, the fraudulent financial disclosures, the suppression of the trust agreement, we expect the motion to be granted within 30 days. When it is, this apartment reverts to its proper legal status, which is property acquired with Carter Family Trust funds, benefiting my daughter exclusively." Derek found his voice. "You can't just, that's not how it works. The divorce is final." "The divorce is final," Richard agreed. "You're not married to my daughter anymore. That part doesn't change. But property rulings can be revisited when there's evidence of fraud, and Derek, we have evidence of fraud. Second," Richard continued, "until the court rules on our motion, this apartment remains in legal dispute. That means no one can be removed from or relocated within the property without a new court order. My daughter stays." In fact, he paused and looked at the property manager, who stepped forward nervously. "I've already been in communication with the building's management company, which as of 2 hours ago has been made aware of the trust's interest in this unit. They've confirmed that no changes to the unit's residency status will be processed until the legal dispute is resolved." The property manager nodded quickly, clutching his clipboard like a shield. Third. Richard turned to Simone. She flinched when his eyes landed on her. Actually flinched, like she'd been struck. "Young lady, you have no legal standing in this apartment. You are not a tenant. You are not on any lease. You are not a spouse, a family member, or a registered occupant. You are, legally speaking, an unauthorized occupant of a disputed property. You have been photographed and documented moving, removing, and interfering with my daughter's personal belongings. You have posted photographs of the property's interior to social media, establishing a record of your presence in a unit you have no right to occupy." He paused. "Let the silence do its work. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings and vacate this apartment. If you do not, my attorneys will file for a trespass injunction, and you will be removed by court order. And Ms. Langley, the trespass filing will become a matter of public record. Your name, your photographs, your social media posts, all of it." Simone looked at Derek. The look on her face was something Nova would remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the look of a woman who had just realized that the man she'd chosen, the man she'd believed was powerful and successful and untouchable, was none of those things. He was just a man standing in a room full of his own lies, watching them collapse around him. "Derek," Simone said, and her voice was small now. "Derek, do something." Derek didn't move, didn't speak. He was staring at Richard Carter with an expression that cycled through rage, disbelief, and something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine fear. Then the rage won. "You think you can come in here and take everything from me?" Derek's voice was loud now, cracking at the edges. "I earned this apartment. I paid the mortgage for 9 years. I worked, I sacrificed, and now you're going to, what, wave some old trust document around and pretend like I have nothing." "You do have nothing," Richard said, and his voice hadn't changed, hadn't risen even half a degree. That was the most devastating part, the absolute, immovable calm. "You had a wife who loved you. You had a family who welcomed you. You had a home that was given to you in good faith. And you threw all of it away for," he glanced at Simone, then back at Derek, "this." "I'll sue you," Derek said. The words came out like a reflex, like a drowning man grabbing at air. "I'll sue you for everything: harassment, intimidation, illegal entry, conspiracy. I'll take you to court, and I'll win." Richard Carter looked at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not contempt, something colder, something that made the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. "Please do," Richard said. "Please take me to court. I have been waiting for you to do exactly that. Because the moment you file a lawsuit against me, Derek, every piece of evidence my team has collected becomes part of the public record. Every fraudulent disclosure, every hidden debt, every wire transfer to your girlfriend's apartment, every text message conspiring with your lawyer to steal my daughter's inheritance. All of it, public record, searchable, permanent." He took one step closer to Derek. "Just one. Your employer will see it, your clients will see it, your friends, your family, your colleagues. Everyone will see exactly what kind of man you are. So please, Derek, sue me. I'm begging you." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Nova counted, 11 seconds of Derek Holloway standing in the middle of a room that was no longer his, surrounded by evidence of his own destruction, with nowhere to go and nothing left to say. Then he looked at Nova. She was standing in the hallway entrance where she'd been the entire time. She hadn't spoken, hadn't interrupted, hadn't needed to. She just stood there, calm and composed, wearing the same quiet strength that her father wore like a second skin. "You planned this," Derek said to her. "You and your father. You planned all of this." Nova held his gaze. "I didn't plan anything, Derek. I just didn't leave. You did everything else yourself." Richard Carter turned to the property manager. "I believe we're done here for now. My attorneys will be in contact with building management regarding the residency arrangements going forward. In the meantime, I expect my daughter's comfort and safety to be prioritized. If there are any issues at all, Thomas will be available 24 hours a day." The property manager nodded vigorously and retreated into the hallway. Richard turned back to Derek one final time. "You have my daughter's address. You know where she lives. But from this moment forward, if you harass her, threaten her, intimidate her, or make her life difficult in any way, I will not send lawyers next time. I will come myself, and I will bring everything." He looked at Nova. And for the first time since he'd walked through that door, the mask of cold, strategic composure slipped, just barely, just enough for Nova to see what was underneath. Her father, just her father. The man who had held her hand at her mother's funeral, who had braided her hair before school every morning for 3 years because he didn't know how and learned anyway, who had worked 20-hour days for decades so that she would never have to feel small in a world designed to make women feel exactly that. His eyes said what his voice couldn't in front of these people. "I'm here. I've always been here. And nobody hurts my daughter without answering for it. I'll call you tonight," he said simply. Then he walked out. His team followed. The door closed behind them with a soft, decisive click. And Derek Holloway and Simone Langley stood in the middle of an apartment that was no longer theirs, surrounded by the wreckage of every lie they'd built their new life on, listening to the sound of expensive shoes receding down the marble corridor toward an elevator that would carry Richard Carter back to a life they would never touch. The silence after the door closed was the loudest thing Nova had ever heard. Simone was the first to move. She picked up her phone from the coffee table, looked at the screen without seeing it, then looked at Derek. "You told me he was broke," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. The voice of a woman whose fantasy had just been gutted in front of her eyes. You told me her family had nothing. You told me this apartment was yours free and clear. It is mine, Derek said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. The words came out hollow, automatic, a recording of a man who no longer existed. Did you hear what that lawyer said? Fraud, Derek. They're going to overturn the ruling. They have your text messages, they have bank records, they have everything. It'll be fine. I'll fight it. I'll get another lawyer. With what money? Simone's voice was rising now. You're $93,000 in debt. You've been paying my rent with money you don't have. You've been lying about everything, about the apartment, about the money, about her father, about all of it. Simone, I'm packing my things. Simone, wait. I'm not waiting for anything. She was already moving toward the master bedroom, and there was something final in the way she walked. Nova stayed in the hallway, listening to the sounds of Simone opening drawers and zipping suitcases in the room that used to be hers. She listened to Derek follow Simone down the hall, his voice shifting from defensive to pleading to desperate in the span of 30 seconds. And she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt tired, bone deep, soul deep, tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from holding yourself together so tightly, for so long, that you forget what it feels like to be relaxed. And now, standing in the hallway of the apartment her father's money had built, listening to the man who had betrayed her beg the woman he'd betrayed her with to stay, Nova Carter leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and exhaled. Simone Langley was gone by Sunday evening. Less than 24 hours after Richard Carter's convoy had rolled through the building's front entrance and dismantled Derek Holloway's entire world in the span of 40 minutes. She didn't leave with drama. She didn't leave with tears. She left with 2 suitcases, a garment bag, and a phone call to a rideshare service because Derek's car was blocked in the parking garage by a vehicle that belonged to the building's maintenance team. Whether that was an accident or something Richard Carter's people had quietly arranged, Nova never found out. She never asked. What she did know was this. At approximately 7:15 on a Sunday evening, Simone Langley rolled her designer luggage through the lobby of the building where she had spent 2 weeks playing house in another woman's home, and she did not look back. Not once. The doorman held the front entrance open for her without saying a word. The concierge, who had watched her arrive with the triumphant energy of a woman who believed she'd won something, now watched her leave with the quiet, efficient composure of a staff member who had seen this kind of thing before and knew better than to comment. Nova didn't watch her go. She was in the guest room, on the phone with Denise, describing the afternoon's events in the measured, detail-oriented way that had become her default mode over the past 2 weeks. "Your father brought 5 people," Denise said, her voice somewhere between awe and disbelief. 6, if you count the property manager. Nova, I am never getting on your father's bad side. I mean it. That man is terrifying. He's not terrifying, Nova said quietly. He's precise. There's a difference. Girl, that is the same thing. Despite everything, Nova almost smiled. But the story didn't end with Simone's departure. In many ways, it was only entering its most dangerous phase. Because Derek Holloway was not a man who knew how to lose gracefully. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing an image of success, power, and control, and the events of that Saturday afternoon had demolished that image so thoroughly that the rubble was visible from space. He had 2 choices: accept the loss and walk away with whatever shreds of dignity remained, or fight, escalate, claw at the walls of his own destruction until his fingers bled. Derek chose to fight. On Monday morning, 36 hours after Richard Carter's visit, Derek hired a new attorney. Not Thomas Whitfield's caliber. Derek couldn't afford Thomas Whitfield's caliber. He hired a man named Craig Voss, a mid-tier litigator who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being aggressive in court, which is a polite way of saying he was loud and combative without always being effective. Craig Voss filed a counter-motion within the week, challenging the Carter Family Trust's claim on the apartment, and arguing that Richard Carter's Saturday visit constituted intimidation, coercion, and unlawful interference with a legal property ruling. The filing was 18 pages long, littered with legal jargon designed to sound impressive, and fundamentally built on sand. Nova's father's legal team responded within 48 hours with a motion that was 37 pages long and built on granite. Thomas Whitfield didn't just counter Craig Voss's arguments. He dismantled them with the surgical precision of a man who had been preparing this case for months. Every claim Derek's lawyer made was met with documentation. Every legal theory was undermined with case law. Every attempt to reframe the narrative was neutralized by evidence so thorough it left no room for interpretation. Compromised appraisal, the hidden debts, the fraudulent financial disclosures, the text messages between Derek and his original divorce attorney explicitly discussing how to misrepresent the down payment, the wire transfers to Simone's apartment, the trust agreement that had been part of the public record for 9 years and had been either ignored or deliberately suppressed during the original proceedings. All of it was laid out, organized, cross-referenced, and devastating. The first hearing took place 3 weeks after the filing. Nova attended with Thomas Whitfield. Derek attended with Craig Voss. The courtroom was small, utilitarian, nothing like the dramatic settings people imagine from television. Just fluorescent lights, laminate tables, and a judge who had seen enough property disputes to recognize immediately when one side had nothing and was pretending otherwise. Craig Voss opened with a passionate argument about Derek's rights as a mortgage holder, about the sanctity of divorce rulings, about the dangers of allowing wealthy families to use trust structures to circumvent fair property division. Thomas Whitfield opened with the text messages. He read them aloud, every one, in a quiet, measured voice that made the words sound even worse than they already were. Derek, sitting at the defendant's table, watched his own words projected onto a screen and read into the public record. His jaw was clenched so tight that Nova could see the muscles working from across the room. The old man didn't put anything in writing. At least nothing we can find. So we argue it was a wedding gift to both of us and split it down the middle. Easy money. The judge's expression didn't change when he heard it, but his pen stopped moving, and he looked at Derek with the kind of gaze that strips away pretense and sees the architecture underneath. The hearing lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the judge didn't rule immediately, but he made a statement that told everyone in the room which way the wind was blowing. The court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented today regarding the conduct of the respondent during the original divorce proceedings. The integrity of this court's rulings depends on the integrity of the information provided to it. When that information is compromised, the rulings themselves are compromised. I will be reviewing the motions in detail, and I expect both parties to be available for a follow-up hearing within 30 days. Craig Voss tried to spin this as a neutral outcome. Derek knew better. He'd spent enough time around lawyers to recognize when a judge had already made up his mind and was just following procedure before delivering the verdict. On the drive home from the courthouse, something shifted in Derek. Nova wasn't there to see it, but the evidence of it appeared over the following weeks in ways that were impossible to miss. He stopped showing up at the apartment most days. When he did come, he was drinking heavily. He'd pour himself bourbon at 2 in the afternoon and sit in the living room staring at the walls, at the furniture Simone had rearranged and that Nova had since restored to its original configuration, at the space where the canvas print of him and Simone had hung before Nova, took it down and replaced it with her commissioned artwork. He didn't speak to Nova. Not with words anyway, but his presence spoke volumes. The half-empty bottles left on the counter. The takeout containers piling up in the kitchen trash. The sound of him stumbling to the guest room, which he now occupied at 3 in the morning. The smell of bourbon and defeat that followed him like a shadow. Nova observed all of it with the same quiet discipline she'd maintained since the beginning. She didn't gloat. She didn't provoke. She simply continued living her life in the apartment that was, day by day, becoming hers again in every way that mattered. Then Derek did something stupid. The kind of stupid that separates a man who is lost from a man who has destroyed himself. It happened 5 weeks after the first hearing, 2 weeks before the follow-up hearing was scheduled. Nova came home from a client meeting to find the lock on the front door had been changed, again. But this time, it wasn't a petty power play. When she contacted the building's management office, they told her that someone had submitted a request to change the unit's locks and rekey the entire apartment. The request had been accompanied by a forged letter, supposedly from Thomas Whitfield's law firm, authorizing the lock change as part of the ongoing legal dispute. Thomas Whitfield had not written that letter. His firm had not authorized anything. Someone had created the letter using a template that mimicked the firm's letterhead, complete with a forged signature. The building's management company, already on high alert after Richard Carter's visit, immediately flagged the discrepancy and contacted Thomas Whitfield directly. Within hours, the forged letter was in the hands of Richard Carter's legal team, along with security camera footage from the building's business office showing the exact moment the request was submitted. The person who submitted it wasn't Derek. It was Craig Voss's paralegal, a young man named Jason Teague, who had walked into the management office wearing a messenger bag and a nervous expression and handed over the forged letter with the confidence of someone who had been told this would be simple. It was not simple. Thomas Whitfield filed a supplementary motion with the court within 24 hours, presenting the forged letter, the security footage, and a sworn affidavit from the building's management company detailing the fraudulent lock change request. The motion accused Derek Holloway and his legal counsel of attempted fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of the court's pending review. Craig Voss, to his marginal credit, immediately withdrew as Derek's attorney. Whether this was because he genuinely hadn't authorized the forgery, or because he realized the ship was sinking and wanted to get off before it went under, nobody knew for certain. What everyone knew was that Derek Holloway was now without legal representation, facing a fraud investigation, and scheduled to appear before a judge in 14 days. The paralegal, Jason Teague, was questioned by the police and admitted within 40 minutes that Derek had contacted him directly, had offered him $5,000 cash to submit the forged letter, had provided the template, the fake signature, and detailed instructions on what to say if anyone asked questions. Derek denied all of it. Of course he did. But the phone records showed the calls. The text messages showed the instructions, and Jason Teague's signed statement painted a picture of a desperate man grasping at the most reckless option available because every legitimate option had already failed. The follow-up hearing was rescheduled to accommodate the new evidence. When it finally took place, Derek appeared without an attorney. He'd tried to hire 2 more in the intervening days, but word had gotten around. The legal community in the city wasn't massive, and when 3 separate attorneys decline to take your case, the 4th starts asking questions you don't want to answer. Derek represented himself. He stood before the judge in a suit that no longer fit quite right because he'd lost weight, the kind of weight loss that comes not from discipline, but from stress and bourbon and sleepless nights, and he argued that the forged letter had been created without his knowledge, that Jason Teague was lying, that the entire situation was a misunderstanding orchestrated by Richard Carter to destroy him. The judge listened. Then he asked Derek a single question. "Mr. Holloway, can you explain why your phone records show 17 calls to Mr. Teague's personal cell phone in the 3 days preceding the submission of the forged document?" Derek could not explain this. The judge ruled from the bench. The original property ruling was vacated. The apartment was placed under a temporary trust protection pending a full review of the Carter Family Trust's claims. Derek Holloway was ordered to vacate the premises within 14 days. He was referred to the district attorney's office for investigation into document fraud and obstruction, and he was ordered to pay the Carter Family Trust's legal fees, which by that point totaled just over $87,000. Derek stood in that courtroom and heard the numbers, heard the ruling, heard the judge say the words "vacate the premises" like they were a weather report, and something behind his eyes went dark. Not angry anymore. Not defiant, just empty. The look of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, Nova watched from the living room window as Derek loaded 4 boxes and 2 suitcases into a rented sedan parked in the loading zone outside the building. He made 3 trips. He didn't look up at the window. He didn't come back inside to say goodbye. He just loaded his things, sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine, and then pulled away from the building where he had lived for 9 years, where he had been a husband, where he had brought his mistress, where he had tried to erase his wife, and where he had ultimately erased himself. Nova stood at that window until the car disappeared around the corner. Then she turned and looked at the apartment. Her apartment. Quiet. Still. Hers. She didn't celebrate. She sat down on the couch, folded her hands in her lap, and breathed. Just breathed. In and out. The way you breathe when you've been holding your breath for so long that the simple act of filling your lungs feels like a revelation. Her phone buzzed. A text from Denise. "Is he gone?" Nova typed back 2 words. "He's gone." Denise's response was immediate. "I'm bringing wine and Thai food. Do not argue with me." Nova didn't argue. The weeks that followed were not the triumphant, cinematic montage that people imagine when they hear stories like this. There was no dramatic makeover scene. No standing on the balcony with arms spread wide while inspirational music played. Healing doesn't work like that. Healing is slow and ugly, and full of days where you feel worse than you did the day before. And the only thing that keeps you going is the knowledge that going backward is no longer an option. Nova had the apartment, but the apartment was full of ghosts. Every room held a memory she hadn't asked for. The kitchen where Derek had told her she was paranoid. The hallway where Simone had giggled about how awkward it was that Nova was still there. The guest room where Nova had spent 14 nights listening to the sounds of a life being built on the ruins of her own. She started with the master bedroom, stripped it bare. New mattress, new sheets, new paint. A warm, soft gray that she'd been wanting to use for years, but Derek had always vetoed because he said it was depressing. She thought it was peaceful. She was right. Then the kitchen. She reclaimed her shelves. Her French press went back in its place. Her mother's painted mug went back on the hook by the window where it belonged. She bought fresh flowers and put them on the counter. Something she'd stopped doing years ago because Derek said they were a waste of money. Room by room, she took the apartment back. Not just physically, but emotionally. She removed every trace of Derek and Simone, every residue of the life they had tried to impose on her space, and replaced it with things that felt like her. Colors she loved, art that moved her, books she'd been meaning to read. A small framed photograph of her mother on the mantel, smiling in a garden somewhere, wearing a sun hat and holding a trowel. Denise was there through all of it. Almost every evening, she'd show up with food or wine or just herself, sitting on the couch while Nova painted walls or reorganized closets, talking about everything and nothing, filling the apartment with the sound of friendship, which is its own kind of renovation. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Denise said one evening, watching Nova hang a new piece of art above the fireplace. "What? That first night after you found the credit card statement. When you called me and told me to bring wine, you were so calm, I thought you were in shock. But you weren't, were you?" Nova adjusted the frame's alignment. "I was in shock, but I was also making decisions. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. You're scary, you know that. I'm not scary. I'm precise." Denise laughed. "You sound exactly like your father." Nova smiled. "For real this time. Thank you." She called her father that night. They talked for over an hour, not about Derek. Not about the apartment. Not about legal motions or trust documents or forged letters. They talked about her mother. About the garden she used to keep. About the Sunday mornings when Nova was small and her parents would drink coffee on the porch while she played in the yard, and the world felt so safe and complete that the idea of it ever changing was unimaginable. "Daddy," Nova said near the end of the call, "how did you know about Derek, about all of it? How did you see it when I couldn't?" Richard was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different than the one he'd used in the apartment that Saturday. Softer, older. The voice of a father, not a strategist. "I didn't know everything, baby. I just watched. I watched the way he talked about money. I watched the way he talked about you when he thought I wasn't listening. And I watched you get smaller. Year by year. Less of your laugh. Less of your opinions. Less of the girl who used to argue with me about everything because she wasn't afraid of anyone." He paused. "A man who truly loves a woman doesn't make her smaller, he makes her bigger. He makes room for her to fill. And Derek never made room for anyone but himself." "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you loved him. And a father learns, sometimes the hard way, that you can't protect your child from loving the wrong person. You can only be there when they're ready to stop." Nova closed her eyes. "Thank you for being there. Always, baby, that's not even a question." The criminal investigation into Derek's forged documents moved slowly, the way these things do, but it moved. Jason Teague's testimony was corroborated by phone records, financial traces, and a paper trail that Derek had been too desperate and too arrogant to cover properly. 6 months after the judge's ruling, Derek was formally charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for probation, community service, and a restitution payment that, combined with the legal fees he already owed, pushed his total financial exposure well past $200,000. His career didn't survive the charges. His firm, which operated in the highly regulated world of investment management, terminated his employment 3 days after the indictment became public. The termination letter cited conduct unbecoming and material breach of the firm's ethical standards. Derek's professional licenses were suspended pending review. His LinkedIn profile went dark. His social media accounts went private. The man who had once driven through wealthy neighborhoods dreaming of the life he deserved was now living in a one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, driving a 10-year-old Honda he'd bought with the last of his available credit, and reporting monthly to a probation officer who called him Mr. Holloway with the kind of politeness that sounds worse than contempt. As for Simone Langley, her exit from the story was almost anticlimactic. She never contacted Derek again after leaving the apartment. She never reached out to Nova. She simply disappeared back into the world she'd come from, the world of promotional events and brand partnerships and curated social media feeds. As if the 2 weeks she'd spent in Nova's apartment had been nothing more than a content opportunity that didn't pan out. Nova saw her once, about 8 months later, at a restaurant downtown. Simone was at a corner table with a man Nova didn't recognize, laughing, touching his arm, performing the same rituals of charm and availability that she'd once performed for Derek. She didn't see Nova. Or if she did, she didn't acknowledge her. Nova felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just a vast, peaceful indifference. The emotional equivalent of an empty room that has been cleaned and aired out and no longer holds any trace of the person who used to occupy it. Denise, sitting across from Nova, followed her gaze and raised an eyebrow. "Is that who I think it is?" "It doesn't matter," Nova said. And she meant it. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, Nova hosted a small dinner party in the apartment. Not a celebration, not a revenge tour, just a gathering of the people who had carried her through the worst period of her life. Denise was there, of course. 2 colleagues from her design firm, who had covered her client meetings without complaint during the weeks she could barely function. Her cousin Angela, who had flown in from Chicago just to be there. And her father, who arrived in a town car at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn the day he walked into the apartment and took Derek Holloway apart. They ate pasta that Nova made from scratch, a recipe her mother had taught her when she was 14. They drank wine. They laughed. They told stories that had nothing to do with divorce or betrayal or lawyers or trust documents. They were just people, in a home, enjoying each other's company, which is the simplest and most valuable thing in the world. After dinner, when the guests were scattered around the living room with coffee and dessert, Richard Carter stood by the window looking out at the skyline. Nova came and stood beside him. "It looks different at night," he said. "It does. I used to stand here with Derek, and he'd point at the buildings and talk about which ones he wanted to own someday. And now?" Nova looked at the skyline, at the lights, at the city that had been the backdrop of her worst days and was now the backdrop of her recovery. "Now I just like the view," she said. Richard put his arm around his daughter's shoulder. They stood there for a while, not speaking, not needing to, watching the city move and glow and breathe below them. People ask about the story sometimes. People who heard about it through the legal community or the building staff or the whisper network that connects anyone who's ever been through a bitter divorce. They ask Nova if she regrets staying, if she'd do it differently, if the fight was worth it. She always gives the same answer: "I didn't stay because I was desperate. I didn't stay because I had nowhere to go. I stayed because that apartment was built with my family's sacrifice. And I refused to let a man who betrayed me walk away with it just because he had the audacity to think I wouldn't fight." She pauses when she says this. Lets it settle. "He called my father expecting to humiliate a broken man. He expected my dad to come crawling, begging, ashamed. What he didn't understand, what he never understood about my family, is that we don't break. We bend. We go quiet. We watch. And when the time comes, we move with everything we have. 30 minutes. That's how long it took for Derek's entire plan to collapse. 30 minutes between the phone call and the knock on the door. 30 minutes between the man he thought he was and the man everyone saw him become. Nova Carter lives in that apartment today. She runs her design consultancy from a studio space she leased 2 blocks away. She sees a therapist every other Tuesday, not because she's broken, but because she's building, and building requires maintenance. She talks to her father every Sunday evening. She has dinner with Denise at least once a week. She sleeps in the master bedroom she redesigned from scratch, on sheets she chose herself. Under a ceiling she painted a soft, warm white that catches the morning light in a way that makes the room feel like it's glowing. She hasn't dated anyone since the divorce. not because she's closed off, because she's learning something that takes most people a lifetime to understand. That being alone is not the same as being lonely. That peace is not the absence of love but the presence of self. That the most important relationship she will ever have is the one she's rebuilding day by quiet day with herself. Some mornings, she stands at the kitchen counter with her French press and her mother's painted mug, watching the steam rise and the city wake up outside her window. And she feels something that is hard to name but impossible to mistake. Derek Holloway thought she was staying because she was weak. He thought her silence was surrender. What he never understood, what men like him are fundamentally incapable of understanding, is that some women don't fight loud. They fight with a patience that looks like passivity until the moment it reveals itself as power, and by then it's already too late. If this story hit home for you, if it reminded you of your own fight, your own resilience, your own moment of standing firm when everyone expected you to fold, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from today and what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, never underestimate a woman who refuses to leave.